Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for being here tonight. Let's go ahead and get started. For folks that I haven't met before, my name is Danny Zaki. I'm an organizer with the San Francisco Bay chapter of Sierra Club and predominantly work on Bay, shoreline, and water issues. This webinar is part of our monthly educational webinars on water-related issues. And if you're interested in knowing more about these kinds of events, please go ahead and let me know in the chat. You can drop your email and I'll let you know about our upcoming events and add you to the email list. And tonight I'm really excited to introduce David Helvarg. David is a writer, author of 6 books, and the executive director of Blue Frontier, an ocean conservation group he founded. He's covered ocean and climate issues on all 6 continents, including Antarctica, which is awesome. He co-hosts the Rising Tide Ocean podcast and is a licensed private investigator. And without further ado, David, I'll hand it off to you.
Great. Well, thanks for joining me, folks. And yeah, I think one of what we're starting to do with this talk actually is it's the 10th anniversary of my book, The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea. And let me lift it up. Introduction by Ted Danson. And basically it's a book about, it's probably my most hopeful book. It's about how Californians have learned to live well with their coast and ocean. At the time it was published 10 years ago in 2013, San Francisco Chronicle was one of a number of positive reviews, said made you feel optimistic about the future. So I figured the future's here. It's 10 years later, and while I may not be as optimistic, I still feel like, at least when it comes to coastal adaptation and resiliency in the face of the climate emergency, that California is still positioned to lead the way. I think that, it's unfortunate that a lot of what got accomplished is impacted by forces beyond any state or individual's control, mostly the overwhelming power of the fossil fuel industry to delay action to where we're now living in the climate emergency that we've been warned about for more than 30 years. I think it was 1986 that I did an interview with Roger Revelle. It's kind of the father of US oceanography, and he started talking to me about the risk of climate change that he'd been documenting since experiments in the 1950s. So what are the factors and the changes? I guess I could go through the book pretty systemically, because some of the changes are actually for the better. The opening chapter is called Native Tides, and it's really about sort of the deep history and experiences of native California tribes, particularly coastal tribes going back over 10,000 years, when there was also significant sea level rise. I mean, it rise, and we saw 300 feet instead of the 6 to 9 feet that are projected in the near term, the next 100, 150 years. Of course, there were hundreds of people instead of millions of people at the time, and the sea level rise was more gradual. It was reflecting the ice melting during the last ice age, when the glaciers began to go down. So you can imagine San Francisco Bay with a hunting squad going out through this wide valley, green valley, and past some wooded hills, and 23 miles beyond, with California condors circling and grizzly bears and their cubs, that this hunting party would probably have made a wide U-turn around. And eventually, about 23 miles out, they'd come to some bird rocks, and a couple of miles beyond them is where the beach was, and the Continental Shelf dropped off, and that's where they would basically hunt and kill sea mammals, elephant seals and the like. And then the long process of slaughtering them, prepping them, and dragging the meat back, and keeping the bears at bay and the wolves and all of what was life in California. Anyway, that's, you fast forward just a few centuries, and that meadow was not Meadow River Valley is now San Francisco Bay, and those rocky points are the Farallands 23 miles offshore. So dynamic changes that happened up and down the coastline. A lot of the Chumash, for example, who were really using California's native tar and trees that floated down during our El Nino storms to build the Tomas, the most advanced transportation ships of their time. And interestingly, they were trading, and the Carpinteria is a town named after the first Europeans, saw them building the canoes along the shore there. And they were trading along an area that today is the LA Long Beach Port Complex, the largest trading complex in the Western Hemisphere. So they were all living on Sonsonate, which was one big island that, as the seas rose, became the Channel Islands. And I think there was a slow retreat to the mainland. And there's a creation myth that Chumash have that a rainbow appeared to the mainland and the people got on the rainbow to cross over. But if they look back, they fell into the ocean. But their tribe's creator being a little more sympathetic than mine, which turned everybody into pillars of salt when they look back. These people, the creator took sympathy when they fell into the ocean and turned them into dolphins. So whenever you take that ferry from LA out to Catalina, you always see these super pods of dolphins, which always make me wonder who they are. Back when I was writing this book, they were creating they passed the Marine Life Protection Act, started creating marine protected areas up and down the coast, but failing to consult with California tribes who had traditional access. And John Laird, when he became Secretary of Resources, did a lot of diplomacy to get a lot of the tribes invested in the process. But so, you go forward 10 years now, and there's real progress there that Native Californians, despite historic traumas of displacement and mass killings, today are part of the coastal conversation. You have the Yurks up in the largest tribe and several other tribes on the Klamath River who have negotiated over years, and we're finally, the last checks have been checked, and in the next 2 years, they're going to start taking down a series of outmoded dams on the Klamath River and open up 100 miles of additional river to historic salmon runs. And this is sort of a climate response, in that California salmon are still facing quandaries from warming oceans and warming rivers. And this is a great restoration project. It'll be the largest dam removal in U.S. history to date. And everybody on the Snake River up in Idaho is watching it closely. We also have, just recently in 2022, last year, they established the Tribal Marine Stewardship Network, which is basically a collaboration between the state and 5 tribes to kind of better manage and do climate adaptation along 220 miles of our 1,100-mile coastline. And of course, there's also now the proposed Chumash National Marine Sanctuary, which would be the first of NOAA's marine sanctuaries, both nominated and named after a coastal tribe, and would also be part of the 30 by 30 program, protecting 30% of land and water by 2030. That's both a federal and state initiative. And although, some people, some of the commercial fishing groups and others and spear fishermen complain about these marine protected areas kind of allowing no take of or exploitation, no drilling, no fishing. But the science keeps showing that when you have protected areas, they're more resilient, and you see a tremendous resurgence. The natural resiliency of the ocean brings back a lot of the habitat and the fish. One example of that is the state has just finished a 10-year study of its own network of marine protected areas that cover 16% of state waters. And this is the latest of a number of studies that basically show, when you leave things alone, they tend to come back. you can, there's a limit to resiliency, and we're testing those limits. But right now, these networks of protected areas are the places like Point Lobos off of Monterey that's been protected for 30 years. And it's a place me and every diver wants to dive, because every cold water diver, because it's full of life, and there's more, the kelp there is more resilient. Chapter 3 of my book is Ghost Forest, which talks about the decline of kelp forest, through the early 2000s as a result of overfishing and pollution and other impacts. But I could still, while I was writing the book, go and do dives through kelp forests, kind of like, cold water corals, in the sense that it's an incredible living habitat that's right here in California. It's the only time I realized why you need a dive knife, is the kelp will just try and grab your regulator out of your mouth or wrap around your arms, and it's like any thick overgrown forest, but and faster growing. They can grow up to a foot a day, grow 100, 150 feet through the water column from the hold fast to the surface canopy, full of life. I mean, helps free a leopard shark that was stuck in an abandoned lobster trap. And a few minutes later, like some 800-pound sea lion on the hunt cruises by, not interested. He's working, but in the Channel Islands, the harbor seals are really curious, and they'll come right up to your face and check you out and go running off, and then wonder why you're not following. Think you're some kind of, disabled marine mammal. But unfortunately, between, starting in 2014, we had this cascading effects that are all climate linked, where the kelp forest started, there was what they call the blob, warm water that sat off of Northern California and Oregon for several years. It's part of the increasing number of marine heat waves we're seeing because of climate change, and that weakened the kelp. And at the same time, there was a sea star wasting syndrome. Not a virus, not a bacteria. They're still not clear, but they are clear that warm water supercharges this disease. And so we lost all our sunflower stars, which are key predators on purple urchins. So the kelp was weakened. The purple urchins realized there were no big sea stars predating on them, and they came out of their hidey holes and started, instead of eating drift seaweed, they started eating the roots out from under the kelp. We used to have sea otters up in Northern California, but we exterminated most of them. It wasn't until the 1930s we found the last colony off Monterey, and they recolonized Monterey Bay from Big Sur. But the big lobsters, the 500-pound black sea bass, they're gone. The otters aren't there, and so the last predator on the urchins was these sea stars when they wasted away. And then the urchins came out and basically wiped out the already compromised kelp, and now you have massive urchin barrens, they call them. Basically, we've had some recovery in Southern California with the giant kelp. It's coming back. Off the last time I drove down Big Sur, I could see it's coming back there. But the bull kelp from basically Golden Gate up to at least Cape Mendocino is 95% gone. And this is the kind of example of where we protected a lot of these resources and put them in protected zones. And yet this is a disaster that people aren't that aware of. If you're living in Fort Bragg, I was up there a few weeks ago. If you're involved in the tourist industry or fishing, you're very aware of it, because the last abalone diving, recreational diving, was a $40 million a year project for the area. And the commercial urchin fishermen, with the purple urchins taking over and the kelp disappearing, that took the red urchin and the commercial urchins away. So now what you have is a bunch of volunteer and state-paid divers suctioning or taking hammers to the urchins and hoping that they can start opening up the possibility for restoration. But when I was up there and talked to the Noyo Center, they're saying, minimum 10 years to see it come back if the waters that have cooled back again stay cool. So these are the kind of And of course, I wrote it up for the New York Times, sort of California's other forest disaster. I knew they'd take it because anytime California is in trouble, the New York Times loves that story. And I'm pretty confident if the Golden Shore, if I'd written a book that said, instead of saying California is a world model for how to live well with your coast and ocean, if I'd written a book that said California sucks and is killing the ocean, it would have gotten a starred review in the New York Times. I'll say, well, not a conspiracy theorist. After 50 years of freelancing, I'll tell you that the East Coast major media does not like good stories out of California. They like wildfires. They like collapsing marine systems. But we'll keep doing, the right things. Now, the right things in terms of California, a lot of the things that worked really well, and a lot of our victories are the things we don't see. I mean, we're living here on San Francisco Bay. At least this is the Bay chapter of the Sierra Club that's sponsoring this. And second largest estuary on the West Coast. And, first it was, and it went through cycles. I mean, we're a late, in terms of the, colonial settlers, we're a late marine frontier. The Spanish didn't show up until the 1770s, and Americans really showed up for the gold rush. It's kind of the gold rush and World War II kind of were the demographic bombs for California, where huge numbers of people arrived. But we took out a lot of the wildlife early, as colonial settler forces do, wiped out the indigenous wildlife along with a lot of the indigenous people. And then the 49ers boomed in. I mean, I got a chapter, Age of Sail, Richard Henry Dana, 2 years before the mast. It's a great book about early Spanish California. He was sailed around with these hide boats that were collecting cattle hides from the rancheros and then transporting them around the Cape back to Boston. And he described, at one point, he was 2 years a common sailor. He went back and wrote a great book that sort of introduced the United States to California as this very exotic and distant land. And he remembers in 1833, at the end of his cruising, there was the Pilgrim, his sailing boat, and another a Russian sealer down from Alaska. And they were the only two ships anchored in San Francisco Bay. He said, if in the future California becomes a great nation, the heart of it will be this wilderness bay. There were 30,000 Thule elk crossing Sansu Straits every year. The bay was full of whales and otters. And, then the floodgates opened and all these predominantly young men of every nation showed up for the gold rush, which was, pick and pan for about 5 years, and then it industrialized, and they had these big hydraulic cannons they built that just sluiced off whole hillsides, and those hillsides just flooded down across the valley and into San Francisco Bay and turned it from clear to murky. You get a sense of that during our recent our recent atmospheric river. You see all that soil deposition, all these drought rivers that are just now flushing thousands of tons of sediment, of soil into the bay and the coast here, and everything turns brown. Well, that happened at such a scale that basically it took until the last decade, 150 years, for it to settle out and a lot of the clarity returning to San Francisco Bay. But in the interim, there's a lot of bay fill, including a lot of the ships that came to San Francisco, and people just, sailors abandoned ship to go off chase gold. And so a lot of those ships became landfill. And later it was garbage. And by the 1960s, a third of the bay had been infilled. And then in 1959, the Army Corps of Engineers proposed filling in most of the rest of it. So basically the bay would become a fat spot in the Sacramento River. And that, in the early 60s inspired people. First, it was 3 women. They couldn't get the Sierra Club or any other group to activate to stop this plan. So they formed Save the Bay, 3 women and a radio DJ, and they started a movement. that would evolve into the BCDC, the Bay Conservation and Development Council. Was the first real coastal management group that became a model when Peter Douglas was writing legislation for the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission. And starting in the 60s, you saw, the cleanup of the bay and people rediscovering their waterfront. And then at the national level with the Clean Water Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Today, we got next week for Point Melati, we're talking about river otters are back, and the best scientific observations of harbor dolphins is from the Golden Gate Bridge looking down, because they went away during World War II, but they discovered that narrow entry about 20 years ago, and now hundreds of harbor dolphins are in the bay. You see some of the whales coming in and out, water quality's improved. These are all the changes, and mostly you see a lot of bay that would have been fill, and a lot of places like the South Bay where by the 1960s, David Rockefeller and Gulf were fighting over who take down San Bruno Mountain to fill in the South Bay for new developments. And people have a sense of like particular victories, like they didn't build on the Marin headlands, or they didn't put, they didn't fill in Bolinas Bay and put a heliport in a hotel complex. But the scale of it was really overwhelming. The plan was expand Route 1 to 4 lanes, every 20 miles have connector roads with 101, build cities all along the Northern California coast, power them with nuclear power. They were going to build a nuclear power plant in Malibu. They were going to build 4 of them at Bodega Head. You can go up there and see the hole in the ground. Finally, somebody pointed out the earthquake fault that ran right through there, but plans were an atomic park in a city of 350,000. All the way up the coast until people said enough. And in 3 years after the Santa Barbara oil spill, people voted for a coastal commission and 2 key principles. One is you don't allow unsound development on the coast. And 2, you do allow public access to the coast, because with that access, you protect what you love. And people love the California coast. When Peter Douglas had cancer, I was talking to him. I said, he said, yeah, I'm closing up my part of the process. But he says, this delegation from the World Bank came by and they said, yeah, we've been here 6 weeks. The Koreans asked us to look at coastal protection. We found the best coastal protection on the planet here in California. But what we don't understand, says the Coastal Commission, normally regulatory agencies within 7 years that being established, they're captured by the industries they're supposed to regulate. So how are you 30 years into it and still doing good? And he says, because we get beat up. We're transparent. In every public meeting, the public comes in and beats us up to do good by their coast and ocean. That sense of entitlement that Californians have, that the coast and ocean belongs to all of us. And this is another sign of progress I'm seeing, where it's not just tribal engagement, but groups that we've interviewed on our podcast, like Wahinis, which is, young women of color becoming surfers, entering, the surf line, and founded by, daughter of a farm worker. And she didn't get to surf till she was like 32. And then she realized, where are all the other brown girls in the water? So she started a program to train young women, and has trained them all up and down the state, and also in Costa Rica and Palestine. It's gone global. And she said, it was all young girls until like this 7-8-year-old boy came up to her and said, can I be a Wahini too? Can boys surf? So it's opened up, but the challenges remain. It's opened up, but every time it rains, there's still 72-hour wait to go in because of the polluted runoff. Places where we've built. Author once said, in California, we build our cities where the earthquake faults are and the water isn't. LA might be a very sustainable city of 500,000, but you got 80 square miles of a valley that's concreted over, impervious. And so, every first winter rain, the head of sanitation there calls it the big flush, because all that runoff from the mountains and over the streets, ends up in the waters. And so, there are those ongoing challenges, all of which are intensified by climate change. The USGS did a study a few years ago that says by 2050, essentially it says that the wildfires are not going to be our worst challenge. By 2050, with sea level rise, we'll probably have 150,000 Californians displaced and 30 billion of damages. Maybe an underestimate, we got a few billion of damage just the first half of this winter, because, it's not like storms aren't normal, but we have, a variable climate in California, and climate change just makes it more variable. So more intense, wet seasons and drier historic droughts in between, and all of that, in one way or another, flows or fails to flow down to the coastline. So these are the challenges. I had one of my last chapters called Rising Tides. We've known about this for a long time. The Coastal Commission, the Coastal Conservancy, the Ocean Protection Council, all have a lot of engagement on all these issues, but I spent part of the day watching the Ocean Protection Council meeting. Well, Stuart was watching people drop in at the Eddie surf contest out in Hawaii. Great initiatives, but there was a lot of funding in the last 2 years of tax surpluses. Now that we have a deficit, the governor's decided that one place to cut is along the coast. So we have, how much is he cutting? I just wrote down. So the coastal adaptation funding for the Coastal Conservancy cut $297 million this year. That's a 45% cut. It's a $69 million, 36% cut to the Ocean Protection Council that the lieutenant governor is also sitting on. This is the governor says, well, we'll make it up with a lot of the new federal funding that's flowing under the IRA Climate Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. But he also keeps talking about California as a nation state, and sends delegations to the Biodiversity Summit in Montreal last month, and live up to it. If California is really functioning as a nation state, then we got to keep our leadership position. Lead from the front, make a commitment. Our coastal counties account for 80% of our GDP. So as a state or a nation state, so you really have to not do these sort of short-term responses to long-term challenges. You have to make the commitments and make them long-term, and hope that it works, because I think it works in California because people are committed, and also, quite frankly, because we sort of have a democracy of blue interests. I mean, in New England, they think the fishermen own the coast, and that's why there's no cod off Cape Cod anymore. In Florida, it's totally big ag and developers, and hell in a handbasket if you're living on the shoreline. But California, we have, the world's greatest network of marine science research stations. We have the Navy, of course. Navy's like a big player. We have the largest port complex in the Western Hemisphere. We have the fishermen, we have the surfers. I got a chapter on surfing as a cultural icon of the state. We have this diversity of people interested and engaged with the ocean, which makes for great family fights that tend to end up with good outcomes. And so the outcomes are good. California, I think, is still an amazing place. The last 2 chapters in my book are the urban coast and the redwood coast, which was basically just an excuse for me to start at the Mexican border fence and then work my way up to the Oregon border and have a lot of fun on the way. One of the losses in the kelp forest is of some of the abalone. I recently visited the UC Davis Marine Lab out in Bodega Bay, where 90% of the world's white abalones are living in tanks there. And they're just 15 years after I wrote a Sierra magazine piece, pan fried to extinction. 15 years ago, people were saying, well, get them back in the water in 5 years. So 15 years later, I wrote the new story, which is we're just beginning post-COVID to reintroduce white abalone into some kelp in Southern California. Hope they grow back. Again, a big part of our history, the Bohemians up in Big Sur wrote a poem years back, the Abalone Song. Oh, some folks boast of quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. Oh, some like ham and some like jam and some like macaroni, but our tomcat lives on fat and juicy abalone. And then it goes on. The more we take, the more they make in deep sea matrimony. Race suicide will ne'er tie the fertile abalone. Well, that part was wrong. We can take down anything, including shellfish. And we just have to learn how not to. And again, the Golden Shore is a good place to learn how not to. So with that, now let me read. I forgot, it's the 10th anniversary. I used to have fun reading from the book. So let me just read the end, which was, as I say, when you write books, you're hoping you'll have a lot of fun. And my Coast Guard book and this book were the most fun to go out and research. I was going to hike the Lost Coast, and then my friend Dave was going to bring his Boston whaler. And in the end, I flew the Lost Coast with a guy named Joe, who flew down from Garberville to Shelter Cove, where they have this little airstrip with a couple of vultures and deer at the end of it. And we flew up. It took 2 days for the fog to clear. We were taking off, and he was telling me how, marijuana oil cured his gout or whatever, because, it's like the Chamber of Commerce when you're in Humboldt, you have to get the rap. But we're flying north along the Lost Coast, which is the largest untracked stretch of coastal wilderness south of Alaska, 60 miles. And what do I say? So we're there. Oh, I just lost. Okay, one sec. I still want to. Let me find it then. And anyway, we were, he was talking about property values. The south facing growing properties were like more valuable than what you pay for land in like Newport Beach. But anyway, we're flying, I say, up ahead beyond Humboldt Bay, which again, amazing place. Just had lunch on Sunday with the mayor of Eureka, the largest coastal city between Portland's sort of coastal, between San Francisco and Portland, largest coastal city, Eureka, 27,000 people. So we can talk about why half the state isn't populated. Up ahead beyond Humboldt Bay, we can see a wall of gray, a weather front from the Arctic building up. We climb to 2,500 feet as turbulence begins to kick in. The coast flattens out below us. We passed over the wide, wandering mouth and alluvial plain of the Eel River. The mighty Eel Joe grins, and I'm impressed by the cattle and dairy farms spread around Ferndale. It is real Farmdale where there's 80 to 100 feet of river silt topsoil, he explains. We fly over Humboldt Bay and the harbor entry and its twin jetties and miles of breaking surf on either side, look across the Samoa Peninsula toward the small city of Eureka, before we bank around, head back over the mountains to Shelter Cove. And turning south under spreading cloud cover broken by shafts of radiant sunlight, looking at the approaching wilderness cliffs and sea rocks, contrasting starkly against the dazzling bright silver sea, I take a slow, cool breath, feel a sense of wonder and transcendence, that moment of connectedness you sometimes get being part of something larger than yourself. Looking across the curve of the Pacific, I'm reminded of all the connections that link those who go down to the sea and those who work and play upon its waters, and those who remember lost to the sea and those who are redeemed by it and feel compelled to give something back. Thanks to luck, history, and lots of good stewardship, seems to me at this moment that our sacred blue marble planet shines just a little brighter here along California's Golden Shore. So anyway, 10 years on, and anybody got any questions?
That was awesome. Yeah, if any folks have questions, please go ahead and you can just shoot them off. Lisa, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so that was quite a trip. Million years of history, 1,000 years of history, or more. And in just a few moments, it
Yeah, I didn't
reminds me.
start with the tectonic plates this time.
Yeah, right. I was gonna say, it reminds me of what the Museum of Natural History usually does when they try to talk about evolution, and they get down to the last, 1/64th of an inch to say, where we humans evolved. But from an Easterner perspective, hearing about similar problems on the West Coast, albeit you have your own issues and your own geography and things that are germane just to the West Coast. I thought it was fascinating because it's the same. It's the same.
Yeah.
And the only thing I thought of two things. One is that if marine biologists were in power and not the politicians, everything would look different, and we would have probably saved much more earlier on, and that's just not the case. Um, and I think the pressures really are in population movement. Like what happens when, say by 2050, when there's more melting and more sea rising, and populations are being forced to move and be on the move as they already are, in areas on the globe where there are low-lying islands, right? We've already seen that in President Clinton's time. So it's just a matter of time. If things aren't done more rapidly in a good way, the pressures on populations are going to force people out of office. People won't be voting for the same people anymore. So it's such a conflagration of things all happening at the same time, and very little. Okay, there is movement by different agencies and organizations to protect, but by the federal government, as you just told us, money's being cut, so the movement is less essential to the government, less rapidly happening to save and protect areas on the planet. And I just want to say one more thing is that on the East Coast, NOAA is establishing an advisory, a sanctuary, a Hudson Canyon Sanctuary Designation Advisory Committee. Blah, I got that all out. And so I'm hoping to be able to be on it. But basically, it comes down to designating, as you know, designating an area to be protected. But there are so many stakeholders who knows how it'll shake out. But it would be really nice and an amazing thing to have in our very own backyard here. I live in Fort Lee, New Jersey, by the GW Bridge, so I'm right on the Hudson.
Yeah, no, that would be amazing. I was above the Hudson Canyon, which is basically the river goes out to the sea and becomes this incredible marine canyon. I was there with on the Atlantis with the Alvin, Woods Hole expedition on 9/11, and so they said, captain called me up to the bridge, and we heard on the radio, on WINS radio, the collapse of the towers, and kind of, shocking being that distant. And then we got the Navy called in and said, don't drop the Alvin. And what I figured was they were putting nuclear submarines in the canyon because they had an aircraft carrier battle group off of the city at that point, and they always have submarine support. So, but we were looking at these creatures in the depths of the ocean, and I kind of had this feeling of like our capability of as a species from exploring the most remote habitats on the planet to creating mass murder in our urban centers. And I'm more frustrated and despairing because we know what the solutions are for most of these issues. We just haven't created the political and social will to enact them.
Yeah, for sure. And wow, what a day in your life that must have been for two big reasons. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. Oh, Stuart, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been intrigued with this massive infusion of capital into this whole carbon monetization, and particularly the blue economy piece of it, and the $8 billion in the IRA for nature-based solutions. And I wonder if you've put your bright bulb into that area and envisioned how it could be used creatively, as opposed to everybody fighting over carbon credits and, you know, futures and whatnot, but how it can really empower local communities, empower projects for restoration, resiliency, that if that type of funding was available.
Well, that's the follow-up we're doing to our Ocean Climate Action Plan, which now there's a White House Ocean Climate Action Plan that's about to be finalized, and all the muckamucks in DC say it's not the same Ocean Climate Action Plan, but it has all the same elements. So we're happy not to take credit. It's just then one of those elements is the investments, and $10 billion in the IRA for coastal restoration and ports. And so a lot of our follow-up is going to be trying to facilitate, make sure that, the old journalistic thing, make sure there's not excessive waste, fraud, and abuse, and that it gets to communities like, where Pam and I live, Richmond, California, where the state has committed $36 million to, acquisition of Point Melody, 400 acres, the last unprotected headland, which includes 120 acres of pristine eelgrass. And so this is what we call blue carbon. This is a healthy habitats like eelgrass and kelp forests and mangroves that not only provide incredible biodiversity, but also take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So there's this surge of funds that can be used correctly. The challenge, of course, is I just wrote an opinion piece for the Tribune Syndicate with my partner at the Center for the Blue Economy, saying, now we've got initial legislation. Let's look at the bigger challenges, which will include we have to, the developed countries that have benefited from climate change have to fund
Right.
climate transition for areas like Pakistan, which has produced less than 0.5% of all the global warming gases, but a third of their country was underwater this year as a result of climate. So the challenge of long-term funding transfer and the idea that people in a country like the US would see it as, foreign aid for unthankful people or something, that's a huge challenge. And, also like Lisa just said, the challenge also is population, and specifically, people who aren't refugees are going to be migrants. I mean, we're either going to move out of the way of the worst impacts, or we're going to be forced out of the way. And so looking at and step one, of course, is also a good anti-war strategy. Get off petroleum ASAP, and then you're also no longer funding the petro dictatorships like Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia and I don't know, Texas.
You left Mexico out.
Yeah. But it's the IRA bill, which was sort of a miracle. We thought it wasn't going to happen, and then it did. And it's a great piece of legislation for 1989. Now it's just the beginning of what has to be a serious transition of everything, industry, agriculture, transportation, the maritime sector. I mean, California led on the greening ports. The feds are giving $3 billion for decarbonizing the ports. Started in LA Long Beach. They've sort of backslid since Geraldine Natz was kicked out as executive director of the Port of LA. But San Diego is now becoming a lead green port, both reducing its pollutants and also using eco concrete to create habitat along their seawalls, and also restoring wetlands and growing using reef balls to grow oyster reefs in the South Bay to try and do what our friend John wanted to do and keep the South Bay from drowning.
Yeah. There was a front page business profile of the New Orleans port in the New York Times today. I was thinking of you. It's really its transition, how it's really moving into a modern day port. Really
I'll check that out.
Resilient, yeah.
Floating port.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this. And thanks for all your work.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, David. I'm wondering, what's your next book?
I was trying to sell the lighter side of the apocalypse, but this agent thought it wasn't.
I knew it would be a good response.
It's true. I don't know. I really feel like it's 10 years on. I gotta get a book rolling. Right now, I just did a long essay, which is with a major magazine. So fingers and fins crossed, kind of on 50 years of freelancing. I realized I started covering the troubles in Northern Ireland in 1973 and just watching the changes and also the changes in the media industry that are, and the loss of so many newspapers and all the number one category of membership in society, environmental journalists used to be newspaper reporters. Now it's freelancers, and they're pretty much all the same people. So to paraphrase a saying about the 1930s, first they come for the journalist, and then we don't know what happened.
Lawrence, I see your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Hi, David. I'm just challenging you to write a book or a long essay, short book or a long essay on how Pramila Jayapal's We the People Amendment could solve all of our problems, because the public needs to get excited and think that we can really do big things that other generations have done, like amend our Constitution so that we can restore the power of the people and take the power away from corporations. That's it. I think you could be the person that could write a book like that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's sort of, I just got Ralph Nader's new newspaper, the Hill Citizen, and it's a lot of mentioned that and other things. And I mean, the only problem is it's not online. It's like, I'm trying to convince Ralph to get into the 21st century. So
Yeah.
40 pages, great backstory. I'm a wage slave for Starbucks, and but yeah, I mean, basically reform it. And there's so many things we know we could do: direct popular elections and getting money out of the electoral system would be great. I've also thought, I tried to get a book on California burning, sort of Cal Fire and climate change, and I think I got jumped by too many fire books that are out there. But the other one I really would like to do is Nation State, is really talk about California's influence on the world and also on how subnational entities, states and regions and peoples can influence the way we operate on this blue marble. So I'm between agents. Anyone know a great agent? Let me know.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Awesome. Anyone else have any other questions before we end tonight?
No, I just have one more observation. I was in Green Wave has a marine a seaweed farming course going on right now, and it's very interesting. And I thought I once wanted to be a seaweed farmer, but I also once wanted to be a tugboat captain. So at any rate, it occurred to me that these
honorable professions.
Yeah. They have a lot of people from the West Coast on as guest speakers, and as well as the East Coast. And it occurred to me that some of these people were formerly in other marine professions. They were lobster fishermen or fish fishermen, and they gradually moved off into the seaweed farming emerging industry. And so my point is that everything is changing around us so much in the marine world. The regular land population of humans doesn't realize this, and they're very much disconnected from this. But in the marine world, people are changing jobs, and now they're moving off of these the kinds of catches they used to go after into marine algae farming.
Right,
And
and going from offshore oil to offshore wind. My friend's son just became a mariner. He just took his tanker into dry dock and they put a new paint on the hull, and he says they're measuring 5 to 10% fuel reduction just from having a new slicker paint. And he was just on my our Rising Tide Ocean podcast. So let me put a final plug for talking to a lot of marine people, because as Lisa just said, you know, there's 8 billion of us, and on any given day, there are only about 50 million out on the other 2/3 of the planet that's ocean. So the more we know, the more we meet the people who live on and by the sea. It's just a, you know, fascinating. I call it the blue beat, you know, the only resource not fully exploited in the ocean being good storytelling.
well, I want to thank you so much for this talk, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Please.
Thank you, David.
Awesome. Thanks, David, so much. This was awesome. Thanks, everyone, for being here tonight.
Aloha.
Thank you all.
Have a good night.
Good night.